thank you for accepting our invitation. You have more than 25 years of research in viticulture and enology. You started with a bachelor at the University of Adelaide in agricultural sciences. You did your PhD more in the field of horticulture, and then started to gain experience and knowledge in viticulture and enology through different cellar hand positions, working in the cellar, working in the vineyard, and then ultimately went back to the University of Adelaide, took up a position as a lecturer researcher, and today obviously very important within the team of Adelaide University. Since we have come to know each other, I obviously know that you were very strongly involved with the Terroir Congress that was organized in 2020 in Australia. Unfortunately, COVID meant that the Congress could not take place in person, but by hosting such an event, obviously you showed already not just your knowledge in viticulture and enology, but also your connection and your network with the local industry. As such an event often has the objective to both allow scientists to come together, but also show how our research is applicable to different contexts and different situations. And I will come back to that. You were awarded in 2016 a very prestigious award as a leading scientist in wine research, that you were co-awarded with another scientist. And today you are supervising multiple master and PhD positions. So thank you very much for joining us, Cassandra. And maybe to start by allowing you to introduce yourself. Can you tell us a little bit more about your current research projects, about the current research that you're doing at the University of Adelaide? Maybe within the context of Porter Protocol, also mention how you're conducting these research projects in relation with local stakeholders, if it is grape growers, winemakers, but also regional bodies. If you can give us an overview of your current research projects and the relationship with the local industry.
Thank you for the very nice introduction, Etienne, and hello to everyone online. Thank you for the first question. So I guess my background is pretty broad, and I've worked in many different aspects of viticulture. I definitely haven't had one focus, and I think one of the main reasons for that is that I have worked out in industry. I've run a winery, run vineyards, and because of that, everything that I've been focused on in terms of research is about delivering back to industry. In terms of what we're doing now, I thought I'd mention a few different projects. One that we're pretty excited about is focused on vitivoltaics, so the use of solar panels in the vineyard. And having that dual purpose of generating energy, but also potentially protecting the vines, particularly from some of the aspects of climate change that have already been mentioned this morning. What's exciting about this particular project is that we initially started by looking at the grapevine response, which is pretty common to other places around the world and makes sense. As a viticulturist, that's the first question you're going to ask. But then over the last few years, we've developed a team that are very broad in their expertise. So we've got engineers on board, we've got landscape architects, we've got wine chemists, sensory experts, lots of different types of engineers, and really started to look at how we configure something like this from many different aspects, including how it relates to the wine business and how potentially this could not only protect the vines, generate energy, but also be a talking piece for the wine business itself. Mm-hmm. And to do that, we've engaged with wine businesses. Just maybe 3 or 4 months ago, we actually installed a system at a cellar door in one of the wineries that's located in McLaren Vale. And at the same time, we're able to gauge what consumers actually think of this, which has been really valuable. And we've been working with people like Armando Corsi, who I think has some association with this group here, to think about the end game for this and what other benefits we might generate. On top of that, I think having people like landscape architects involved have been really valuable as well. They've given us a different way of looking at it, and how using something like photovoltaics might actually change the landscape of a region or a vineyard, and how we need to think about that in the design. So most of the structures are pretty straightforward and can be seen as being quite engineering heavy. So we've at the same time been thinking about what that might mean for the landscape as a whole. So that's one of the areas that we're focused on at the moment, and it's been nice working across different expertise within the uni, but also working with, say, partners in Italy, in Piacenza. So Stefano Poni, we've been collaborating. They've been working on similar systems, and also in other states around Australia, and even on different crops. So it's been a really interesting project with a lot of benefits that we didn't necessarily predict when we first set out to do this. In terms of other areas that our team works on, I've done quite a bit looking at the use of different alternative fertilisers. So things that can be made from waste streams, potentially almost classified as biostimulants. And a lot of those have come from industry. So either locally, but also overseas, people wanting to trial their different products, because there is a lot to choose from out there, but they don't necessarily have strong evidence to back up their potential benefits or uses. And then in terms of climate change, we've also looked at quite a few reactive strategies, so looking at different netting systems, different shading environments, anti-transparent, things like that we're working on. And again, we have collaborations where we're looking at different places around the world. So we're working with groups in Austria, in Italy, and sharing our results and almost collecting 2 seasons of data in the one year. So that's been really useful as well. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention is we work a lot on the vineyard floor space and how we manage the soil, what types of practices we use, what species we grow, and how we can improve the resilience of vineyards through those strategies. Yeah.
Okay, and Cassandra, if we come back to the study on solar panels and looking at what are the challenges today from let's say a logistic perspective for the vineyard operations? I know a lot of the work is done mechanically in your vineyards in South Australia. And you mentioned McLaren Vale as an example. Can you give us a little bit the agronomy constraints for the farmer to use and to enter the vineyard?
That's a great question, and we spent a lot of time working side by side with the owner, with the vineyard managers of this particular business that we've just made that installation. And yeah, you're right. A lot of the practices are already mechanised, and they obviously don't want to stop that. And so we had to carefully design with our engineers a system that was going to work for all of that machinery. And so what that has meant is that the overall system is quite high. And at this particular site, it's also quite windy. So we needed to make sure that we had the strength in the system to be able to manage for that type of scenario. It definitely was achievable, but the more infrastructure you have, the greater the cost. So I think one of the challenges going forward will be how we also make that affordable.
And that's probably
the risks and the trade-offs, I guess, from using that. I think what they're excited about is that, we're moving to electrification of a lot of equipment, and this type of strategy means that you can be more self-sufficient. At least in Australia, there's not a lot of gain for selling the energy because we have plenty of sunshine and many solar panel systems already in operation. So the real gain is, electrification of your equipment as well as that protective side of things for the vines themselves.
Similar to what we have seen with some solar designs becoming more self-efficient with electricity. So in your context, you're looking at the ownership belonging to the company. Because in a lot of the funding that we're seeing in Europe for these type of projects, it's normally a collaboration between a private company that owns the solar panels, and they will benefit by selling the electricity to, let's say, the government. Whereas in the case of Australia, you're looking at the ownership coming back to the company and maybe a form of, as you've said, of self-efficiency or a form of even diversification in terms of revenue.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah,
Yeah.
more self-sufficiency overall, I would say.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
also being able to run your winery. So we deliberately located this particular system right next to the cellar door.
Yes.
And how it works is that people can be tasting wine and discussing the solar panel system, but that energy is also feeding back into the winery and the cellar door.
Okay. And so coming back a little bit to vine performance. So obviously we're asking questions about what's the impact of the less sunshine exposure on the leaves, the bunches, the initiation of flowering, and then the composition of the berry. Can you tell us a little bit about your initial results looking at because you even mentioned that the studies that you're doing on nets and shading. So we're coming back to the principle of removing, let's say, direct exposure. Your ambient temperature probably is influenced by these solar panels. Can you tell us a little bit about the biology of the vine and how it reacts to this new local environment?
So far, generally, what we see is that it buffers more for those extreme temperatures. So in Australia, we are not light limited. We have plenty of light. This is not one of our challenges. And, one of our concerns going into this was, okay, well, maybe we'll see a decline in yield because we are creating a more shaded environment. And we know that grapevines are very reliant on that to produce those little inflorescence primordia that then become bunches and then our yield. But in our environment, because the shade is not constant, we've seen no decline in yield.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the wine chemistry or fruit chemistry, we've seen that we maintain our acid levels under the shaded environment more than we would in the exposed situation. And even in some years, it varies between the seasons, but we've also seen some benefits in terms of colour and phenolic development as well. And we've been running this for about 3 years at the moment. Another interesting one is in terms of wind and other factors that it just buffers for a little bit, having that structure in place, things that you don't think about.
Yes. Yeah.
Have been, real benefits from this type of system. In terms of the canopy, they generally do produce a little bit more canopy, but overall the leaves are slightly thinner, so that they adapt to their environment. And at least in the systems we've looked at, it hasn't been in a negative way.
Yes. Okay. No, and I think the questions are, as you've mentioned, you already collaborate with other countries like Austria. You mentioned Stefano and Piacenza. So the more we get knowledge from different growing conditions, the more this can become a scalable and adaptable solution for different wineries in different contexts. The question of climate change, and you mentioned that when you mentioned the different topics that you're looking at, I asked this question because obviously, if you think about Australia, you compare it with Europe, our research has evolved massively in the last 10, 20 years towards the question of climate change, whereas Australia has always grown almost vitis vinifera in a climate that's much warmer, much drier. Has the question of climate change evolved in your research as much as we can imagine in Europe? What are the questions that you are asking differently compared to maybe when you started at the University of Adelaide with this question of climate change? Is it a problem for you? Is it something that you are looking at specifically? Or is it, as always, the question been, how do we adapt to this warmer ambient temperature, looking at the problem of drought? You mentioned the fertilization. I imagine that's related to drought and yield. And can you maybe talk about the question of climate change and how this has maybe influenced and impacted your research over the last 20 years?
It's a great question. I would say that the whole time that I've been in research, it's been part of the question for exactly the reasons that you've talked about. So rather than the last 10 years, this is this has been for the last 20 in terms of looking at how we're going to deal with those hot and dry conditions, because that's a part of our landscape and that's the environment we work in every day. In terms of how it might have shifted, I would say it is embedded in all our projects pretty much now in some form or another. It's always part of the question. And whether that's, that it's more prominent in...
Yeah, I'm obviously asking the question because I know it's my follow-up question. And the reason I'm asking this is that actually Australia is such an interesting country where we can learn a lot about research, about viticulture, because a lot of the topics that we're dealing with today, you have been dealing with it for the last 10, 20, and even more. Even I will come back to the question of old vines, but there's a lot of topics that we are currently seeing as urgent and priority questions in Europe. And I'm thinking about the colleagues also in North America, or where normally we have cultivated varieties at what we call the lower suitability range. So it means that a lot of the good vintages were explained by, let's say, weather patterns, temperature, drought. Whereas today we're cultivating varieties in a much, let's say, closer to the upper suitability, and even for some regions it's above the upper suitability. And a lot of our good vintages today depend on proactive adaptation solutions, winemakers being more aware about climate change and seeing how the conditions are changing and implementing changes from vineyard design to managing the vineyard. So maybe the question is a little bit more general in terms of scalable solutions, looking at also the experience that we can draw from, let's say, McLaren Vale as a premium wine producing region. You move to Barossa, you have more a balanced model between volume, premiumization, and then Riverland being much more volume. And a lot of your research has been done on these different contexts. Can you, as we talk about challenges and solutions, can you tell us a little bit about scalable solutions that you can bring to the Porto Protocol initiative, things that you have seen that work very, very well in your context, which is, again, very warm, very dry, maintaining yield, maintaining quality, and something that we can learn from the extensive research that you have been already doing for a couple of years.
Yeah, okay. Probably one of the first things I think is redesigning the vineyard floor. I would say this is one of the biggest shifts that I've seen in my career, and really moving away from bare earth and cultivation where possible, and knowing that you can do that in a hot and dry environment, and that there are real benefits in terms of water infiltration, soil structure, soil biodiversity, protecting from evaporation, protecting the root system. So, I talk to a lot of my friends who are vineyard managers or owners, and one of the biggest shifts they've made is that vineyard floor in terms of just simply protecting their root system, because that's also cooking. A lot of our root systems are sitting pretty close to the surface, and when we have a bare soil, that's a huge problem. And especially when you start getting into the temperatures that we've seen, you're essentially cooking that root system. So I think that's one of the big scalable things that can be done. And it doesn't have to be a really complex mix of species. They can be really simple changes to build that living vineyard floor that has real benefits for these challenging environments, or environmental conditions, I should say.
Yeah, and
so that's the first one.
Yeah, and as you say, it's something that you already know works well in your climate. Can you tell us a little about the species that you have seen that is quite working quite well?
For us, the species that have a lot of medics, clovers and medics, work pretty well, and some of our grasses can also be pretty valuable. Again, you need to tailor it to your soil types, to your rainfall, and all of those things. And I think that's probably one of my take-home messages as well, that there's definitely not one size fits all for any of this. It really needs to be done at the local level, wherever we are in the world. So in terms of translating what we've done in Australia to other parts of the world, I think it's, yes, learning from some of our practices, but then taking that and really thinking about your situation and how you can, tweak things to make it fit with your needs. But overall, that flexibility is really important because we never know what we're going to get every season. All of us are being faced with extremes at either end of the spectrum. So building resilience into the site, I think, is another key message I'd like to mention.
No, but it's interesting you come back to the soil as that buffer capacity for this uncertainty that you mentioned. That's probably our best the toolbox solution in terms of buffering weather variability, the uncertainty of how the climate will be tomorrow, and coming back to what you've mentioned as such a important aspect of covering the soil, making sure that we have living soils, and this comes back to having a flow management strategy that makes sense compared to soil tilling. And again, coming to your climate, it can be seen as a radical decision because we think about competition, we think about how grasses, if it's annual or perennial, will compete with the vine. Maybe tell us a little bit about the challenge of initiating that flow cover crop, if it's perennial, annual, because again, I think that's the main issue often for getting an initial species that can dominate and cover the surface of the soil.
It's a great question. So probably the first time I started working with this in a lot of detail was a trial we set up about 15 years ago in the McLaren Vale region again. And we were fortunate that a producer allowed us to set up an experiment where we compared organic, biodynamic, a low input conventional system and what we called a high input conventional system. And we did this at scale. So we replicated it 4 times for each management system. We had buffer zones, and each block was about 0.2 of a hectare. So you can imagine that this was on a very large scale. And this was working really closely with the owners and managers of this particular wine business. And what we found initially, because people really weren't doing this, so at that point in time, people were still herbiciding heavily or cultivating heavily, but this particular business was really wanted to move to a more organic approach, but wanted to test it first. So we set up these different scenarios, and initially when we did it, we did see a drop in overall vegetative growth and reproductive development from allowing things to grow both under vine and in the mid-row area. But I would say what's happened since that is you've almost got to let the system settle down for a few years. And as we've done more and more of this, we also know when to maybe go in and mow things, or maybe just cut things back a little bit so they aren't so competitive, but you still have that coverage and protection. And we've learned that with time. We definitely didn't get that right at the start. If that sort of answers the question.
And I think it comes back to what you've mentioned. If you modify that initially, then the vine that was normally herbicide or with a low input of conventional practices, maybe the rooting system was quite shallow and it needs time to adapt. And then over time, the vine finding its balance and then producing again the acceptable yields that they need and the quality of the grapes. Maybe this is a nice transition because I wanted to ask you this question. When we think about vulnerability and adaptive capacity, and you mentioned the local context of each winery and how we find solutions that are fitted to that context. I know you worked a lot with the sustainability scheme and program in Australia, which is now massively adopted across the different regions of Australia. Do you think there's differences of degree of vulnerability between the organic, the biodynamic, the more conventional producers, and especially at the vineyard level? If we think about designing adaptation pathways, do we see different degrees of vulnerability?
It's a good question. It's not an easy one to answer.
No.
I think I have been doing this a while, and my opinion on this is that it's less about how you define which system you're using, but probably more about how you focus on the soil and the environment that the vines are growing in. one of the nice things about a lot of organic and biodynamic producers is they have that focus and they put resources into that soil-plant relationship and often see the real benefits. And I've seen them buffer some of our extreme weather events more than, say, a conventional system that maybe hasn't thought about that or invested in that. What on the flip side of that, though, when you have a conventional system, you have all those you have those chemical choices that you can use and be reactive with that an organic producer doesn't have. And I've seen organic and biodynamic producers fall over because they didn't have those tools to work with. Interestingly, though, I think it was about 2010, we had very, very wet conditions. And so disease was everywhere. And immediately people thought that the organic and biodynamic producers would fall over because they just didn't have the chemistry to apply. But at Yangara, a good friend of mine, was practicing organics, biodynamics at the time, and they just really focused back on the principles that we all learn about in terms of good canopy management, about selectively harvesting the fruit. And honestly, some of their wines were the most stunning I saw out of that vintage, when many were not great. It was really tough vintage. So I think personally, I'm not attached to organics, biodynamics or conventional. I think there are great tools in all of them, and the ideal situation is to capitalise on those to build a really resilient vineyard to buffer these climatic extremes, is from what I've seen as well.
Yeah, and the way I interpret your answer is that there are solutions that can be adopted regardless of the management strategy that is adopted. And through organic and biodynamic farming, obviously there's a strong focus on soil health and the buffering that soil can provide, but paves the way for solutions for conventional growers. And then at the same time, obviously there's organic and biodynamic producers that are restrained with the number of choices they have. But by being proactive in the vineyards, understanding even at an individual level, maybe how the vineyards are performing, how they can intervene, and at the end of the day, harvest grapes that are of great quality, acceptable yields, and moving forward. I see there's a couple of questions, and I will come back to them. But I wanted to maybe ask you something about the old vines. So initially you mentioned, when we were talking about the solar panels, the plant even adapting, you mentioned the thickness of the leaves, and finally the plant being very reactive to its local environment. And so in the context of climate change, we talk about proactive or adaptive capacity from a human perspective. But if you think about your Grenache and your Syrah being planted in the Barossa since the middle of the 19th century, they have had so much time to adapt to a very different climate compared to maybe southern France or Spain, wherever the Grenache came from. And maybe to why I ask you the question is, if you think about Australia again as a country that is a pioneer in so many questions that we're asking today in the context of climate change, you were the first country that not only identified what's old vines, but you even gave categories to old vines, from old vines to what you call ancestry vines. Can you tell us a little bit about your research on old vines, what you can draw from old vines from a plant adaptation perspective? And maybe this can be food for thought in Europe, where we still have so many old vines, a lot of these regional conservatories, and this question about selection, massal and clonal selection, but we will not go into that. But just what we can draw from your experience of working on old vines, please.
Okay. For us, this was, we did set up a trial in the Barossa about 10 years ago, and this was capitalising on a fortunate situation. I think in South Australia we don't have phylloxera, and because of that, we also have these very old vineyards. And as you can imagine, a lot of the owners of those vineyards are very protective of them and really want to preserve that material, and also firmly believe that they make stunning wines, which, from what I've tasted is true. So we were fortunate that in the Barossa, there's a lot of old families that have owned their vineyards for hundreds of years, well, over 100 years. And we were able to select sites where the vineyard, we had an old vineyard sitting right next to a young vineyard that was propagated from that material. So we had the same clonal material sitting side by side, but 150 years versus say 25 to 40 years in age sitting right next to each other. And so what we did was to look at how they were growing in terms of vegetative growth, but also reproductive growth, and then look at their fruit chemistry, make wines from all of these sites, and then at the same time do a little bit of a study on epigenetics, where we look at whether some of what those old vines have experienced is in the genetics of those vines. And at this point, I need to really credit Dylan Grigg. He did his PhD on this project. We initially set it up, and again, this was a really strong collaboration with the Barossa Valley region. They really wanted to see this work done, and the people from those families basically reached out and said, will you have a look at this? Because we're talking about our old vines, but we want some evidence behind this. So all of this was done with them, as well as some funding from Wine Australia for Dylan's scholarship. What we found with this particular study is those old vineyards were largely there because of really good site selection as well. So I don't want to have any myths about that. That was a big part of it. They were on beautiful soil and probably had some buffering capacity because of the site itself. But overall, the older vines did seem to be more resilient and consistent, because we had some quite extreme weather during the years that we did this study. They also yielded more, which is probably opposite to what people generally think. And these are even vineyards that were 20, 30 years old. Also, in terms of, we couldn't see a lot of difference in terms of our traditional fruit chemistry measures. There wasn't a great deal of difference. There was more seasonal variation, but there was a general trend that acidity levels were lower in the old vines. And in terms of the sensory profile, they came out with more lighter, elegant characteristics overall. And there were definitely changes in the DNA methylation levels when we think about epigenetics. So there were definitely some adaptive changes that were going on overall. But that's kind of a bit of an overview of what we saw. It's just a very unique and fortunate situation to be able to look at those beautiful old vines sitting and having those young vineyards right next door.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, if you think today about the principle of functional biodiversity and including more genotypes that can be able to maybe respond differently in the phenotypic expression towards climate variability. I think this is drawing a lot of attention to old vines but I think there's also some things from old vines that we can learn, as you've mentioned, the importance of site selection. And we know that at a certain period, when everything was going very well in the industry, we planted vineyards everywhere. We didn't maybe pay the same attention to site selection and soils that can be able to produce quality grapes regardless of the vintage. Cassandra, I'm going to ask the question because we're going to move towards the end and maybe the last concluding questions. But obviously, you can imagine there's a lot of questions regarding irrigation. We know that to a certain point, if you think about costs and benefits, then irrigation becomes a very reliable solution if you have water. And that's maybe the most important. So coming back to South Australia, some places will have substantial amount of water. You think about the riverland and the fact that they are next to the, I can't remember the name of the river, but they're next to one of the most important rivers of South Australia. Then you move to McLaren Vale, where they have to have water plants. They have to buy water at a much higher price, and which explains also the premiumization of that region, because they have to have an added value where they can reason and justify those costs. So questions are coming, obviously. The person is asking for Italy. There's probably, I don't know where this person is coming from, so I'm going to ask you the question. So obviously in South Australia, you irrigate a lot, but can you tell us a little bit about the irrigation policies, the best research that you have seen in irrigation? I know you have trialed double lines of irrigation. You have used irrigation underground in a way to get the roots deeper. I know you have in the early 2000s, there was a lot of work done on partial root drying irrigation. Can you tell us a little bit about what has been accepted as the most sustainable irrigation strategy today in South Australia?
Good question. It's not, start by saying it's not my area of expertise, but
But maybe I
regardless,
can
I
ask
think,
you which
yeah,
irrigation strategy is probably the most adopted today, because that can
yeah,
answer maybe the
yeah,
question.
I think probably that regulated deficit irrigation is the most common. And while we have access to water in different ways, so like many other places in the world, you mentioned we have river water, and that the Murray River is
Yeah, the
one of our
Murray.
main sources. But alongside that, we can also have issues with salinity, so we really need to be careful about our water source. One of the nice solutions that has happened with irrigation is what is happening in McLaren Vale, where they use recycled water. But as you also mentioned, water is a big commodity, and grapevines compete for water with other crops.
Yes.
And so we're constantly finding ways to use less and to really target the little water that we have at those key developmental stages. So I think deficit irrigation is probably the most common, but also targeting the amount that you have at the right time to maximise the use of it. I would say are the biggest things that we really focus on
Yeah,
here.
because again, when seasons are dry, then obviously the price of water increases, and then you have to manage, like, do any risk management. When do you want to use that allocation of water according to the budget that you have? There's questions about the policy barriers that you sometimes face in South Australia when conducting research. I think the person is asking because, again, if you think about Europe, then often we have a lot of policies coming from
Mm-hmm.
government institutions or regional institutions that can be barriers for conducting research. How innovative can you be in your research without having maybe these policies and these barriers?
I think overall we have less of that um, to deal with. I feel that we are fortunate in that we don't have as many of those rules and regulations that we have to work with. We have a lot of flexibility in all our planting material, no matter where we are in the country. There are limits to water, and that can be whether you can buy it, whether you can access it, whether it's good quality or not. So those are considerations. But I would say policies are not defining what we do in the same way. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, the question was specifically for vineyard floor design, but I think in
Mm-hmm.
your case you mentioned that, yeah, you used different annual species. You also looked at perennial grasses like wallaby grasses. And I think in that context, there were probably no policy barriers that didn't have any influence on the choice and the species that you have to use and how they can become a scalable solution, as you've mentioned with that study that was done in McLaren Vale.
It's a good question though, because while we don't have policy restrictions, we are seeing some species that are resistant to herbicides or just like you say, taking over. And so we're trying to be more clever in what we plant to make sure we've got a mixed system. And ideally, if we get that right, a lot of people are shifting over to what we call spontaneous vegetation, where you're not seeding, you're just letting the seed bank grow. And so it does vary between seasons, and we've seen that this year. We've had a lot of rain, and we've got a completely different mix of species growing on the vineyard floor, but there's enough diversity that it still works, and nothing is particularly dominating, but that's with time. So I'm thinking of a couple of vineyards, and they've been managed in this way for at least a decade, if not more. So it takes time, but we are thinking about that in terms of creating that balance, and even in the vineyard floor.
Yes, yeah. And I think what people are not asking, but I know, and it's a little bit sensitive as a question, we have maybe a lot of policies in European regions, but we still have a lot of subsidies, a lot of government or research funding that is still pouring into the wine sector, because obviously wine is seen as a very important cultural product in Europe.
Mm.
In your case, it's much more difficult. I know that your country went through a lot of difficulty with the tariffs with China. I know that your funding also for wine research is much more complicated. So I think that's more maybe your constraint on your side, getting funding and subsidies that can help you conduct your research in a very substantial and very correct way.
Yeah, that has definitely shifted in the last 5 to 10 years, and very challenging for many of us. And I guess on top of that is, yeah, our growers don't get subsidies at all. So there's no, their businesses have to run
Hmm.
at a profit. There's no way that anyone's going to bail you out of that. And I think that also, and this is something I think we also need to consider in the research world, is that we need to make sure that the risks aren't too great. If we want to make a practice change, then the growers are only going to take that up if it works with their bottom line. And that's something that's very real here. As you
Hmm.
say, we've had some big challenges. And so us being able to translate our research, make it useful is a big challenge. We might have a wonderful tool, but if it's not going to work with the overall running of the business, it's never going to make it. So yeah,
Yeah,
there's some
yeah,
hard
yeah.
realities
I know,
there.
definitely, and that's why I know, yeah, I understand your context quite well
Mm.
compared to maybe the European context, where it's maybe much easier still to get funding for our research. There's a question about epigenetics, and Cassandra, I'm not going to ask you to answer it because I know that it's not specifically your area of expertise on a
Mm.
day-to-day basis. I can maybe just mention that for the people listening, there's obviously the Old Vine Conference. That is another initiative that is taking place. They have invited Dylan on several occasions to talk about his PhD study. A very important epigenetic scientist in France is called Philippe Galouchi. He's a Bordeaux scientist, and you can look up his work. But yeah, I think today we understand the genetic changes that takes place within our clonal material as somatic mutations take place, and this gives us already a lot of diversity within a single variety. And for the European colleagues, obviously, that means that Barbera will have a lot of different clones today. I've seen a lot of different clonal material for Chenin, and I know in Portugal, and as an initiative called the Porvit initiative, they are working a lot on Portuguese varieties. But yeah, epigenetic changes are taking place. I think the thing that we don't know today is how much of that memory is maintained. And you mentioned the experimental design that you have. I think it's this relationship between nature and nurture. Nature being the genetic changes, nurture being the epigenetic memory of the place and how the plant learned to adapt, and how much of that nurture is maintained when we do propagation in old vineyards and we plant new vineyards. But a fascinating a discussion, and again, coming back to climate change, I think it's a very important question that we have to ask in the next year. So that maybe gives me the two last questions that I would like to ask you. What are maybe the research that you would like to see in the next years to come in terms of viticultural research? If it's in Australia, if it's at an international scale, where do you think that we still have a lot of unanswered questions in terms of climate change adaptation?
Um, I think there's a big question around, and you've, I think, already started to touch on it, is what are the best choices in terms of our planting material, and how that works with rootstocks, and how that works with longer term stress. And I don't think we know that well anywhere. Those experiments are very difficult, and I feel like that. I think there are some really great groups around the world starting to think about that, and well, not start have set up experiments to look at that. But I feel like that's a real gap
Mm.
in what we we know, and also how we then translate that information and knowledge to producers to then be able to adopt what we find out from those studies. And then I guess in places like Europe, you've got other barriers in terms of what you're allowed to grow where and how much, and how we can adapt to our different situations. So I still think, there's a lot of work to understand what's going to work best where, and how it's for example, in Australia, maybe our regions where we grow grapevines and make wine will shift in terms of the proportions of what are growing where, and that landscape might look quite different in terms of where and what we're growing to better fit.
I think what you're referring to is, we still have a lot of unanswered questions in rootstocks. We mainly had 3 classic varieties contributing to the 70 or 80 commercial rootstocks that we have today, and there's still a lot of wild rootstock species that we can tap into in breeding programs. You mentioned the adoption of the growers. We know that even if new clonal material is coming out, we still refer a lot to what was initially the initial clones, and we're still planting them massively. And then in a country like Australia, I know that you have adopted a lot Spanish and Italian varieties in regions where normally your French varieties were cultivated. So that asks also a very interesting question about Australia learning about these new varieties coming into your country, and what you can learn from that, let's say, a Spanish variety, Italian variety, or a Greek variety. And I think at the end of the day, if we look at vine material, it's such a good cost and effective solution. It doesn't cost any more to plant one variety to another. And in terms of benefits, we can definitely have varieties that are much more heat and drought tolerant for the same input. You come back to your remark on water. For the same amount of liter of water that I will give to a Merlot compared to maybe a much more heat and drought tolerant variety, my output can be much better. And coming back to the revenue and the money that the farmer or the winemaker can make from that production. And then maybe a last question. Can you tell us about what will be if you have to plant now your vineyard? You're in McLaren Vale. You refer to that region quite often. You may be the owner of a property. How do you see a resilient vineyard design in the context of McLaren Vale in South Australia?
Okay, good question.
Do we go back to bush vines? Do we trellis? What do you think is the way forward in terms?
Yeah, so McLaren Vale or other places, I think for me, whatever it is, it needs to be flexible. I think a lot of what we've done is we've looked at long-term averages of climate and based our decisions on that. But we know, because we're all experiencing it, that things can change quite dramatically between seasons. And having the flexibility in the vineyard design, in the vineyard floor to build resilience, I think has to be part of our vineyards going forward. And I think working with Vitivoltaics has probably highlighted that to me, that even in the structure of the Vitivoltaics, if we're using those, there needs to be flexibility in terms of moving those solar panels, like being able to adapt. If we know a frost is coming or we know a hail event is on its way, can the vineyard design shift and quickly adapt to that kind of scenario? So I see future vineyards looking more like that, and it's going to be a reliance on building resilience through biodiversity, good soil management, all those things that we've been talking about, but also using the technology at the same time to adapt to many different systems, situations.
Yeah, I think accepting that we can no longer be perfect. It's this competition between efficiency and resilience. Resilience actually doesn't mean we're the best. It just means we're the best regardless of what comes. And I think today people use resilience as thinking as a concept that this is the best for, but it's actually a concept where we understand that we don't know anything about the future, and we implement variability, different solutions, flexibility, all these concepts that are part of the resilient concept. But it actually means that For a specific year, we were maybe not the best compared to maybe the vineyard next door, which had maybe that specific design. But when you look at the lifespan of the vineyard over 60, 70 years, then you see that resilience, because the temporal stability was much better, regardless of what was the climate outcome. So I totally agree. I think we have to focus more on flexibility, being maybe accept that there will not be the best vineyard design for that year. But when you look at 10, 20, 30 years of growing those grapes, then you will see the value in that resilient vineyard design that you just mentioned. Yeah, there's a question on rootstocks. I don't know if Marta has organized a talk on rootstocks, but yeah, rootstocks are definitely you mentioned that you don't know phylloxera, but if we look at many regions and countries around the world, then obviously rootstocks are such a big such an important topic, the affinity with the variety, but then obviously also it should receive the same attention as science selection, the variety, the clone, and that's where rootstocks often maybe don't get the same attention. But yeah, definitely a very important topic. Thank you very much, Cassandra, for joining us. I don't know if Marta want to come back up, but thank you for everyone for your questions, for attending this climate or this scientific talk. And then yeah, I imagine that Cassandra can be contacted if you have any questions for her. But thank you very much for attending this talk.
Thank you all, and have a wonderful Christmas. Thank you very much, Cassandra.